Okay, the first thing I have to raise to us is just a housekeeping item. I need to change the time that we're meeting. So I wanted to check with you about this. And next week is totally the same. I just need to change it in March. So I either need us to meet Wednesdays at 10 or Tuesdays at 9.
Wednesdays at 10.
Wednesdays at
Wednesdays at
10.
10 gives you time to like sleep and all that sort of stuff. Great. And so we'll probably finish Islam's by next week. And then we'll decide if we could just be done, or if you want to learn about Hinduism and Buddhism, we can do those too. So, okay, well, let's then, and I'll give you a reminder, and you'll see it in the e-news too, that the time is changing. And thank you for accommodating. So let's do, last week I probably was a little sensitive and said things maybe I shouldn't have. I was maybe a little over opinionated. Reminder, we did talk about some good things like the Hajj. We talked about the Hajj, and we talked a little bit about clerical structure, particularly with jurisprudence, right? We talked about the Sharia. We talked about jihad as the sixth pillar. It's not really a pillar. It's not really a pillar, but it is actually the pillar. Right, the struggle to live life as you ought to. Where we left off was I was going to talk to us about the architecture of mosques, just briefly. They all have some differences and they all have some similarities. And as I mentioned to you, the number one similarity that you'll find in all mosques are a dome. Mosques have to have a dome, even if it's funny, like some modern ones, they've made it square. But that's fine, it's still a dome. And there should be in a mosque also carpets, because you're going to be kneeling on the floor. And you should also have, in particularly countries outside the US, these minarets. This is from where the call to prayer is announced, right? So you can see, right, this is a pretty famous mosque there, which is not a place you're going to go pray, curiously enough, right? It's a tomb. And this is not even a mosque, right? This is the Dome of the Rock. It's the shrine that we'll talk about it in a second when we go to the major holidays. Here's Mecca, right? And as I mentioned, it's got the maximum number of minarets, 7. So the Blue Mosque in Istanbul can only have 6. And then you can see some of these like in Africa, and there you see the minarets there that are made out of mud. So a minaret is a traditional thing. It's where you issue the call to prayer. If you've got a speaker set, you don't need it so much, right? You don't need it so much. You just need to announce the call to prayer so that like people have this awareness that it's time. Now, even if people have it on their phones, it is still a thing you do. You play the call to prayer, which you might call like an organ prelude. Most mosques are going to have a ritual washing area. Could be gender segregated, doesn't have to be, because you're not taking your clothing off. You're washing your arms from elbow to wrist. Right, so men and women can do this in public, although women typically don't do that at the mosque because they don't have to. Turns out men are the unclean ones, not women. We all knew that intuitively. And then there'll be a place down here for you to store your shoes. Because these are woven carpets in general, you want to protect their longevity and you don't want to track dirt on them. The point of them is to keep you out of the dirt. So you leave your shoes inside. And this is true if you were to visit the Blue Mosque in Turkey, you will remove your shoes or you won't go in. And then they might also give you some of those like open house booties, depending which one you go to. Nobody worries about bare feet. Nobody really worries about socks, but these are things you have to protect the carpet. In here, there's a couple of things. You probably know that this little thing here, what do you know? We have those in old churches. They're called ambries in old churches. Does our church have an ambry?
Yes.
In fact, it does not. People use that word because it's now in the Episcopal Church since 1976. We don't have ambries. An ambry is like a niche that the altar was against. But because the altar is not against the wall, there is no ambry. So what do people use the word ambry for now? Well, they use it for the tabernacle that used to be in the ambry. That's the box where you put the reserved communion. But it's a tabernacle, and we don't have an ambry. So some people conflate the two, and you'll find this online, right? You'll say that it'll say that those are equivalent things. I mean, they're not. An ambry is a niche just like that. And we don't have one because that church got built after the new prayer book. We used to have an ambry, curious enough, it's there, but you see it's not semicircular, it's just that glass. So this isn't called an ambry, it's called a mihrab. A mihrab tells you which way Mecca is. Because since 629, when Muhammad, peace be upon him, changed praying toward Jerusalem toward praying toward Mecca, now you need to know which way to orient your body when you make your prayers 5 times a day. Has anybody been to a Middle Eastern country before and stayed in a hotel? There's usually a little thing shaped like a mihrab, like it may be shaped like that, somewhere in a hotel room, like every hotel room in, you name it, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, etc., has one of those, and it probably won't be any bigger than that. And it could be anywhere in the room, and that's telling you which direction Mecca is. Now, in a mosque, it's much larger than that, right? And it actually is sort of carved out like this. Nothing happens in there. Like you don't go in there and consecrate the Eucharist because you don't have that. You don't, it's not like a special place to pray. So you don't, there's like not a magic circle there, but it is a very old and traditional way of locating the holy city of Mecca.
So is it where the point is, where it's pointing?
Yeah, it's where it's pointing. So like in our place, churches tend to build with their primary window facing, do you know which direction?
West.
Jerusalem.
Used to be Jerusalem, now we face them all east geographically so that we can have sun in the glass in the morning.
I see.
Yeah. So they used to be oriented toward Jerusalem, now we're oriented towards Lot. Because of the stained glass tradition that we have, right? Which goes back to Saint Denis in France to like 1100 something.
When they build when they build a mosque, do they orientate that towards Mecca?
Absolutely. Yeah, so you wouldn't want to have your mihrab like in the corner. That'd be weird, right? The orientation toward Mecca determines the layout of the whole mosque.
Now, apparently when Pope Ratzinger, or whatever his name was, Benedict, he said that the churches have to be orientated, if you build a new church, it has to be orientated a certain way. Is that the same way with the Episcopal Church?
We don't have a pope.
No.
How do we orient it? However, the local congregation that's paying for the building wants to.
Okay.
And hopefully that's in accordance with good building practices, right? I mean, how did we orient our sanctuary? Due east, right? And you notice that the Jesus window is rather illuminated, right? If the sun is apparent in the morning. Yeah.
Does the mihrab go through the wall?
No, it's
You know,
just,
thinking.
it's just a little niche.
Okay.
And it usually is pointed, I mean, you know, like historically, there's like the Roman arch,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's like the Norman arch. And then there's the Arab arch, which is like this. Right? So typically you'll see this kind, it's a little more flail. That's kind of what you'll see. It's more of a more parabolic, yeah. And this is called the Arab Norman arch, which is sort of weird. I mean, you get structurally, this does nothing for you,
Mm-hmm.
right? As an engineer, that does nothing. And you probably all know that this arch is like not helpful. Like it's way too heavy. Did you learn about this when you were in pre-calculus? Or in trig? The arch that actually bears is called a catenary. It's a slice of a hyperbola. So like that's the strongest arch on the planet, period. And when you build an arch like that's like that, you've got a lot more weight than you need. I don't know if that makes sense. The Roman arch only works because they're so thick and heavy, but all that extra weight's not needed. Okay, anyway. All right, going back over here. There is next to the mihrab often kind of a, you see this like stairs up here. This is called a minbar. And in the minbar would be where the imam or the mullah or a speaker would offer to you a reflection on Jummah Day on Friday. So you'll make your common prayers and then you will hear a sermon who may or may not be from a lay person, because it turns out truly in Islam, there's no clergy. Everybody's equal. That's the goal, right? We're all one family, we're all the same. Now, that's become impractical, right? As mosques get really big, they do employ people on behalf of others, but it should be the case that no Muslim is greater than any other Muslim. I mean, that was part of the widespread appeal when the Prophet first brought the message is, hey, we're all the same. Oddly enough, like the Prophet was more important than everybody else, but you know, like you get it. And this is how it sort of works. But imams and mullahs are like volunteers. They're bivocational people. Like one of the people over here, there's 3 imams. One of them, the one I know best, who lives in this neighborhood, he's a teacher and he teaches culinary arts at the Islamic school. I think that's where his primary pay comes from. And I didn't know if the Islamic Center pays him or not, or if he just volunteers. But he's one of the imams over there. There's often a room, and here you're kind of seeing, this is like maybe not super helpful, a room for women and a room for children. And like I went to one of the women and children's prayer rooms in Iran, and there was like little indoor playground equipment. So like your kids could like play while you were making your prayers. Those are basics. You'll probably find a library with you know, obviously copies of the Holy Quran, and you'll probably find also in there some commentaries or collections of the Hadith, right? Remember, those are traditions about the Prophet, so that if you're not sure what to do, you do what the Prophet did. Sometimes you'll find like extravagant beauty inside and out. Usually decoration is not done, you know, they take the prohibition against graven images probably more seriously than even our Jewish brothers and sisters, right? You can go to a synagogue and see in stained glass, like a menorah or a shofar or things like that. If you go to a mosque, you're pretty much going to see geometry or sort of stylized Quranic verse. That's it. You should not be images of animals in a mosque. No statuaries, for example, right? So it just depends on your degree of money and culture as to what that looks like. So this blue tile, right, it actually is kind of iconic Islamic art for us. I mean, it is, right? Muslims figured out porcelain from the Chinese before Europeans did, right? So these hand-painted blue tiles are just, they're stunning, right? They're stunning, and the tile work and something like this, I mean, these are made of, I mean, millions of pieces, right? That have been assembled. And there you see, like, oh, I don't see any of that tile. That's because it's an African mosque. It's sub-Saharan, right? So it's truly indigenous to its own culture. Yeah, and you'll notice here that the Taj Mahal in Agra has sort of a different style to it. This is where you're really seeing that Mughal dome or that Arab Norman dome where it kind of flares thin and then bigger, right? I mean, you see that quite a bit in Mughal construction. Okay, so that's the mosque. Yes, sir.
The one in Africa,
Yeah.
there are rebels. I don't know whether they're Islamic rebels or not, but they tend to destroy the mosque in, say, like a place like Timbuktu. is, is there conflict between various parts of Islam that they would destroy each other's mosque?
Yeah, so yes and no. I mean, so keep in mind, and this is good to talk about. There's a few denominations of Islam. I mean, really, there's two, right? There's the Sunnite and the Shiite. And they have, what's different about them is who should be the leader. Some practices, like I mentioned to you, the Shiites put their head on a clay disc, and that they have 3 times a day they must pray, and they do the other 2 when they want. Whereas the Sunnite have 5 prescribed times for prayer. The Shiites have shrines to holy people, like Ayatollah Khomeini, but also to the sort of the 9 proper successors. Those are the holiest sites, but then their uncles and stuff also get shrines. So that's different, right? That's more celebration of saints. But in general, it's like, well, we have some minor disputes, but we're Muslim. Now that can get into conflict more so when politics get involved than when like theology and practice. There's actually a lot of toleration in the Islamic community that we don't exactly have to do it the same way until you throw politics in. So, for example, you've probably heard of this branch of Islam called Wahhabist. Osama bin Laden was a Wahhabist, and what do you know? So is the House of Saud. It's Sunnite, it's not Shiite. It's a very strict interpretation of the Holy Quran and the Hadith. And it has, I mean, the big difference is not like its book of theology. The big difference is its interpretation of the Sharia, like Islamic law. So Wahhabists say women don't go out uncovered. Women don't go to school. So you've heard about this in Afghanistan and Pakistan, right? Which are contiguous, right? Same area. You've heard that this is part of why the House of Saud was not allowing women to drive, right? It's not that that's against Sunnite or Shiite. It's a version of Sunnite. But as you can tell, like a very different way of doing life than having Benazir Bhutto be your female prime minister in a similar Sunnite country. So the big difference does not seem to be Sunnite or Shiite. It seems to be which way of Sharia is sort of indigenous to you and what's the power behind it. Yeah, power, politics. While we're talking about that though, let me go back and do a little bit of Islamic theology. Is that okay? Just a little bit. So let me talk to you about cosmology first. And there's some interesting bits here, because I've mentioned to you that there are 2 branches, that there is the Sunnites and the Shiites. But there's also a 3rd category that can happen in both, right? So the Sunni and the Shia, but then there's a 3rd category called the Sufis. The Sufis are not distinct from either group. The Sufis are sort of like a subset of both groups, and really it's the mystical tradition in Islam. So you've probably heard of the whirling dervishes before. The whirling dervishes are, I mean, primarily because you find them in Turkey. They come from this branch, although you could be a dervish and be a Shiite. And the Sufis are sort of mystics who they can spin around because they get caught up in ecstasy, and they have these, like, I don't want to say out of body experiences, but essentially they have like transcendent experiences. Sufis are like Pentecostals. By the way, you can be a Pentecostal Catholic. You can be a Pentecostal Episcopalian. Like that exists. The only, as I mentioned to you when we talked about Christianity, the only form of Christianity growing worldwide is Pentecostal Christianity. Most African Christians are Pentecostal Christians. Most Latin American Christians are Pentecostal Catholics. Now, it doesn't mean they roll around on the floor, but they are open to mystical ecstasy, and their music tends to support that as well. So the dervishes, you know, the whirling dervishes are people who can spin around in a circle for hours and like never fall down, because they kind of get enraptured and it becomes trance-like and it's mystic. And a dervish, you don't have to be a whirling one. A dervish is essentially like Saint Anthony, one of those people who went out into the middle of the desert to kind of meditate and contemplate and have transcendent experiences with God. So a dervish is a mystic. And a dervish who starts to attract followers is what you should call a sheikh. Now, we use this word interchangeably with words like caliph and Amir and Sultan, right? Those are all leaders, but Sheikh is the one that comes from the Sufi tradition. And a Sheikh should have complete spiritual authority over their followers. Like if the Sheikh tells you to do a thing, you do that thing. Kind of like if your abbot tells you to do a thing in the monastic tradition, you're bound by your abbot, not by your lord. So Father Abbott's got a lot of power, so does Father Sheikh. Now, there aren't women sheikhs. This is monasticism for men. Now, there are female dervishes, sure, but that's getting up there. These ones, because they're mystic, they sometimes have really different understandings of theology and rules. So you hear about this when we get to India as well, that some gurus, this is like the kind of Sufi gurus are the ones that like start to advocate for tantric things. Like, here's the rule, so break it as much as you can. I don't know if you're familiar with this. We'll talk about it when we get to Hinduism, right? But mystical people in general see that since God's everywhere, that breaking the rules is how you get more experience of God, not less. But you have to do it carefully, and you have to do it under the authority of a sheikh. Like, you don't become a sheikh because you want to be. It takes years of dedication and training, etc. Right? So Sufis. In case you're wondering, Jalaluddin Rumi is a Sufi, the poet. I could share with you my personal favorite Rumi poem, and hopefully you can hear some of the mysticism in it. Rumi was probably also gay, it turns out. Hard to know. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Words like you and I no longer make sense. That's mysticism. That's also maybe the Episcopal Church. Beyond ideas of right and wrong, there's a field. I'll meet you there. Yeah. So that does not hold with the strict interpretation of Sharia that says there is a right and wrong and you'd better do it right. There's some recognition by the mystic here that some of that's relative. So like, let's just meet human beings for who we are and not map our relative values on one another. Okay, so I introduced that, and the reason I wanted to do that is because we're going to talk about original sin. Because the Sufis see it rather different from the others. So just like Judaism, Christianity, the world was created by Allah, that's God, as good. And it's not that things got bad or that there was a fall. It's just that we forget. We just forget who we are and whose we are. So reminder, that's why we pray 5 times a day, to remember. That's why we have to make our pilgrimage once in our lifetime, to attach our life story to the original story. That's why we have to give of our resources. That's why we have to fast during Ramadan. That's our annual reminder, right? So we've got daily and annual, and then we've got once in a lifetime. That's to help us remember, because the problem is we shirk. Shirking is when we don't do what we're supposed to do. By the way, that word works in English, right? That's an Arabic word we've adopted into English. You're shirking your responsibility. Except that in Islam, shirk doesn't mean like I didn't do the dishes. It means I forgot whose I was. So shirk is blasphemy. And God created us both for tolerance and justice. So social justice should be very strong. You probably know this, that in Islam, as in old expressions of Judaism, you can't charge interest when you give a loan. So Islamic banks don't charge interest. Isn't that interesting? How do they make money? I don't know. But they do. Now, there are different levels of beings in the world. Hey, this isn't so different. Remember, in Judaism, there's humans, and then there's the cherubim, and then there's the seraphim. And maybe you know some Jewish legend. You've heard about this thing that like is a Prague midrash called the golem, which is a clay being that has a scroll with God's name stuffed down in its throat, which makes it alive. You know the story of the golem? It's this Jewish legend, right? That living in a ghetto, this is what saved them from Christians who were going to come and sack and kill them. A rabbi put God's name down on a clay body and it animated the body and it defended them, right? Because that's the power of God's name. Anyway, so there's like levels of being. And look, many Christian people believe in angels and demons. Many do. And Muslim people have this concept too, right? That there's angels like Jibreel being the archangel who reveals the Holy Quran to Muhammad, peace be upon him, right? So there's Jibreel. But then there's these desert spirits called jinn, and maybe those are angels. Sometimes they're tricky things, you know, they just are powerful beings. And then devils is a really interesting thing. You know, there's like sort of good jinn and bad jinn. So that's pretty similar to angels and demons. There's not a Satan. I mean, there's a Satan figure, but his name's Iblis. So Iblis is the Arabic name for this oppositional power. And here's the story of original sin from the Quran. Original sin is not a human sin, it's Iblis. So God created the human being. Now God is God and transcendent. Like God doesn't feel pain, God doesn't suffer, God doesn't take on a body. That would all be beneath God, right? This is the ultimate transcendent God, Allah. Doesn't have a name. Allah is just the word that means God, like we use in English, right? So Allah creates everything and creates the jinn and the spirits above the humans. And then God says to all of the angels and spirits, bow down to the human being I've made. So, for most Muslims, the original sin happens when Iblis refuses to bow down. Iblis will not bow down to the human being. So that's original sin. A spirit did not listen to God. But if you're a Sufi, Iblis is the original righteous one because Iblis knows not to bow down to anything other than Allah. How about that? So if you're Sufi, Iblis's unwillingness to bow to anything but Allah is the example to follow. Which means you didn't bow to your sultan. You just only bow to Allah. Now think through, if you're able to think of it that way, how it is that there's tolerance of diversity. Because you don't have to bow to me, but you must bow to Allah. I don't have to bow to you. We must bow to Allah. And therefore, it takes a little bit of judgment out of my sort of done with control and puts it in Allah's hands. So it's an interesting thing that Christian, and I'm going to talk about Christian people because we get this, right? Christian people say only God can judge us, but we really like judging on behalf of God. Like as a Christian fundamentalist, we would say, I don't judge well and you're wrong. That's really strange to think through that inherent contradiction to me now, right? And so this is the way of the mystic. So what's the original sin? Was it Iblis or was it everybody else? Now, Iblis, for most Muslims, is the bad guy, right? And kind of like the devil, but to be clear, and Christians have really got this kind of whacked out weird since the Middle Ages. I mean, the devil's a created being. So even if you believe in the devil is not co-eternal with God. So it's a really interesting theological step Christians have made to think like God's fighting the devil. Because that makes no sense. How can it be that the creator would ever have to grapple with a creation? But most of us inherently believe in this struggle between good and evil. It's not Christian. It's not Jewish, but it's contemporary Christology. And Iblis is really just reminding you to shirk. Don't bow down to Allah. Don't obey the Sharia. But from a lesser power position than the devil in most Christian imaginations. Does that make sense? I realize I'm also making a commentary on bad Christian theology as I see it. You're welcome to believe in the devil, you are, but I mean, let's just be honest about it. Like, if God made the devil, how does the devil have a shot?
Right.
And God's so omnipotent and all powerful.
It's so strange. We've almost made the devil omnipotent. Yeah. Strange, isn't it? It's just because we didn't ever stop and think about that carefully.
We still don't.
Well, we still don't. The devil made me do it, right? The devil made, that's convenient. The devil did make me do it. Now, I mentioned to you already, right, that the primary scripture is the Holy Quran, and that the Quran is organized. It's not edited. It's not thematic. It's from longest verse to shortest. The verses are called surahs, right? And the story in Islam is that reminder that Holy Quran is eternal. So it's inerrant. It is without error in original Arabic, which is why you have to learn Arabic, right? And Jesus, who's named Risa, shows up in the Holy Quran. As I mentioned to you, he's the seal of the miracle workers. The prophet does no miracles except recite. I mentioned to you that the Holy Quran has the Akedah, the binding of Abraham's promised son, but reminder, that's Ishmael. And that there are stories that are shared between the Quran and Jewish Midrash, and we're not totally sure which one predates which. So let me give you an example of this. I think I told it to you back with Judaism. This is called Abraham in the Idol Shop. Once upon a time, Abraham, whose father was named Haran. Did he live in Haran? Okay, anyway. Terah. Abraham's father is named Terah, not the plantation from Gone with the Wind. It's got an H in it. So Terah was an idol maker. So he sculpted idols and sold them. And one day he is going out for lunch or something and leaves Abraham in charge of the idol shop. So Abraham gets this wild idea and takes a stick and breaks all of the idols except for one, which is shaped like a monkey, and puts the stick in the monkey's hand. And when Terah comes back and says, "Oh my God, our family income is destroyed. What happened, Abraham?" Abraham points at the monkey and says, "He did it." And this apparently is how this was when God looked at Abraham and said, "I can work with this one." So that's like an origin story for Abraham if you're Jewish, Ibrahim if you're Muslim. That story is in the Holy Quran, but it's also in Jewish Midrash. Didn't make it in the Bible. That's an interesting story, isn't it?
sort of like a childhood brat, who finds his way into faithfulness. So that's kind of what you get. Now, let me see if this link works, because there are literally, yeah, it didn't work. Okay, you can look this up at home. I won't bore you with it now. There are international competitions in reciting the Holy Quran, because the recitation isn't just Allah said to the Prophet, you should do this. They're chanted, and they're chanted in the same kind of way that you would hear the call to prayer. The call to prayer is not Allah Akbar, Muhammad Rasul, right? It's got a steady cadence. There's a vocal rise and fall. Have you heard the call to prayer before? Yeah. So you can Google Quranic recitation competitions. Sometimes links just change, and you can watch these on YouTube, where you can like win international awards worth a lot of money, it turns out, if you can recite the Quran in like signature beauty. And often it is like young boys that are like the age of 12 who do well at this, because their voice hasn't totally changed. Interesting thing though, right? There's and it's not considered a singing competition. It's like the epitome of Quranic beauty in a human recitation. I don't know if this makes any sense.
Would some Islamic folks, like in the Catholic Church, would they castrate young boys to keep the?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Actually, you know what eunuchs are, and you probably heard that eunuchs were used to guard harems. And what we don't realize is Muslim armies discovered eunuchs. They didn't come up with the idea. See, the Byzantines castrated a number of promising young boys to ensure their utter allegiance to the empire, because when you have no offspring and no wife, you have no distractions from your allegiance. So eunuchs were not like, and this is like a bad image for us. We think of eunuchs as like being kind of feminine and like fat and walking around in robes. No. Eunuchs were like Green Berets. So again, they were castrated to. So when the Islamic Empire met these eunuchs, they were like, why are you doing this? Like, and what do we do with these? Oh, because we're from the Arabian Peninsula and essentially have a more African mentality, people have multiple wives. That's how you make treaties, after all. So what we'll do is have the eunuchs guard the harems, because they can't get up to any bad business. But they didn't invent the position. I don't know if this makes sense. Again, we have this image that Muslims invented eunuchs, which is not right. They just reappropriated what you do with them. But I don't think, I realize I didn't answer your question directly. I don't think so. I don't think you castrate boys so that they can recite the Quran in a lovely way. In general, you don't have harems and eunuchs anymore. That was even fading away before the Ottomans, right? That's really a Middle Age kind of thing. Scheherazade and all of that, right? Okay. Talked about jihad. Talked about mosques.
I've got holidays, but let me go over just really fast before I go to holidays. Again, some of the sectarians in a single slide, if I can. Right, so as I mentioned to you, if you're Sunnite, you follow the caliphate. And Abu Bakr was not a direct relation to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but he was chosen to be the first caliph after the Prophet. And then, what do you know, down the way, you end up with these big Islamic empires that we call the Umayyads and the Abbasids and the Ottomans, all Sunnite. Elected isn't quite the word. I mean, there are these power dynasties, but they're not necessarily related to the Prophet. I hope this makes sense.
By the way, did you know that this is true in the Mormon church as well? There's more than one Mormon church. The one you know about has BYU in Salt Lake City, comes from Brigham Young, who was kind of the first caliph. But then there's a much smaller version of the LDS church in which the leaders are all descendants of Joseph Smith. So you know the big one, it's more famous. There is still the small one, which is like the Shiites. So the Shiites, and they have an interesting eschatology too. The Shiites say that and then as I mentioned to you, they wanted Ali, who was like the nephew of the prophet, to be the first caliph. He ended up being the third one. So they stayed together because Ali ended up becoming the caliph. But then like 9 relations down is Hussein, and as I mentioned to you, Hussein went on a suicide mission to take his rightful place as caliph, and what do you know? He died. And so this is a major point of divergence between Sunnite and Shiite. And as I mentioned to you, Shiites still have this day of mourning for Hussein. It's called Muharram. Like no Sunnite person that I know celebrates Muharram. Nobody cares that Hussein martyred himself. Like he should have not done that. But if you're Shiite, like this is really important, and there's a martyrdom element built into Shiite tradition. And the Shiites say that there are 10 imams, and imams are like not just the prayer leader, it's an imam with a capital I, and these are almost like avatars of Vishnu in the Hindu tradition. These are like the 12 apostles. They're leaders, but they also have this like spiritual authority, and 9 of them are gone. So in the last days, the 10th imam will come riding a horse. Can you guess what color it is?
White.
Yeah, of course, right? Because that's in Hinduism and in Christianity, right? The 10th imam will come riding a white horse and herald the end of the age in which all of God's good, faithful people get their just reward, especially Shiites. So if you're Shiite, you're waiting for the hidden or 10th imam to reveal the end of days. Just like if you're a conservative Christian, you're waiting for the mark of the beast and Jesus on the horse and all that stuff, right? And if you're a really conservative Jew, you're waiting for the Messiah to bring a new temple down from the heavens. Most Jewish people couldn't care less about that.
So the leader of the Shia is no longer related to.
Well, actually, yes. The leader of the Shia is related to the prophet. And curious enough, if you go to a country like Iran, the turban you wear as a scholar is either white or black. If it's black, you're related to the prophet somehow. So theoretically, Ayatollah Khomeini is a distant descendant of Muhammad, peace be upon him. Not direct. Muhammad had, peace be upon him, had no sons. He only had daughters, right? And it is patrilineal. So you could be the cousin, or like the once removed great grandson. Does this make sense? There was no male heir to the prophet, which is kind of how you got the divergence in leadership to begin. What if they had just said, you know, one of your daughters would do. A queendom would work for us. Well, I don't know. It'd be different. Okay, talked about these folks already. I had a video of the whirling dervishes. I don't need to show you that, right? It's in some ways it's a little bit of a touristy thing, right? That you go to a dinner show and watch these people spin around for an hour. I mean, you go to Cirque du Soleil and see that, right? I mean, they're up there on the stage just spinning around, but I mean, you know, this is the kind of thing like in Hindu tradition too. These are people that walk on hot coals and their feet don't get burned. And that's like a spiritual thing for them. Okay. And as I mentioned to you, these are the 3 branches, although really there's only 2, right? Sufis could be from either group. And then the other big differentiator is what kind of Sharia are you doing? And the Sharia is influenced, right, by a lot of different things, like which hadith, which stories of the prophet do you accept as valid? The more you accept, well, the more rules you get to have. The fewer you accept, the more there's ambiguity, right? And just like in all faiths, there's no hadith about in vitro fertilization, because that didn't exist. So what do? Some people say, well, since it's not in the text, it's up to us to extrapolate. Some people say, since it's not in the text, we just make our own moral decision. I mean, this is still the case, right? I mean, it's interesting that like Christian fundamentalists like to try to say, well, what does the Bible say about, I don't know, well, like anything, what does the Bible say about gender transition therapy? Well, I can tell you, it says nothing. Nothing. Because that didn't exist. There was no artificial hormones. So some people say, since it says nothing, what does our reason tell us? Some people say, well, it doesn't say anything directly, but we could infer. And it's just really curious to see how people make inferences like that. Usually they infer in a way that supports what they already think.
Yeah.
If you don't mind me saying. I don't know if you realize that this is going to be really unpopular, but I'm going to say it anyway. What does the Bible say about pro-life? What does it say about a fetus's rights? Do you know this? Oh, there's mention. In the Hebrew Bible, if you strike a pregnant woman, if you kill the woman, you die. A life for a life. If you kill the fetus, you pay a fine because it's not alive. Isn't that interesting? The Jewish rule is, it understands that a baby could be born stillborn. So the potential for life does not equal life. Whereas the mother is alive. So whose life is more valuable if you're Jewish? The potential life or the actual one? The mother's rights. The mother's rights. So in Judaism, there is a right to life for women. The right to life is for women. Does the New Testament say anything about fetal rights? Zero. Why did we decide that Christians have to be pro-life? Because a splinter group of the Republican Party decided that if they came out with a hard stance on pro-choice, pro-life in the early 1970s, they could co-opt the Christian vote in the United States. And what do you know? They were right. Because a number of Christians are single stance voters. Are you pro-life? Are you pro-choice? Which are not even accurate descriptions, right? Are you pro-women's rights or are you not pro-women's rights? But in framing it pro-life and pro-choice, right, you've created an artificial barrier. I'm getting into my opinion, but there are books that substantiate what I'm telling you, that this in fact was the brainchild of a small group of not all Republicans, but a small group in order to stack the vote, because they saw the vote changing in the United States, right? They saw it with Lyndon Johnson, for example. So this happened historically. I'm not saying that I'm in favor of abortions. I am saying I'm in favor of women's rights. And I'm saying the Jewish people are in favor of women's rights, and so is the National Episcopal Church. Now, we make our own decisions, but it's just helpful to understand that there's no in utero rights in the Bible. So this is the same kind of gymnastics that all people of faith have to do. What do I do in this instance? I want to go to my sacred texts. I want to. Can I? And in which ways do I have to go to them? Right? So it is true that because Islam came from a very traditional part, very traditional, because it started in the Arabian Peninsula and spread out of the Arabian Peninsula. What do you know? Like there's a lot of Arabian cultural heritage in Islam. And so then you have to decide, do you have to become Arab first to become Islamic second? I know this sounds funny. Let me phrase it to you a different way. If I went to Africa as a missionary and I was sharing the good news of Jesus to a tribe that had never heard it before, and in that tribe, chiefs have multiple wives. Does the chief have to get rid of all but one wife first in order to become a Christian? Or can the chief accept the principles of Christianity and keep their wives? Missionaries have struggled with this for a long time. Do you have to become an American in order to become a Christian? Or does Christianity look different in different cultures? Islam is having this, not conversation, it's having this major tectonic friction right now. What about gay rights in Islam? Well, traditionally there weren't. So still there aren't, but could there be? What about women as leaders? Well, traditionally women weren't leaders. You see, so what's the role of women? It's based on Arabian tradition from the 600s. So if you're an American woman and you want to become a Muslim, do you have to take second seat to your husband in order to do so? Traditionally, the answer has been yes. But increasingly, folks are saying, but why so? So does Islam, exist within one culture, or are there multicultural expressions of Islam? And keep in mind, we're doing this with Christianity too, because anytime you find yourself saying, we didn't do that when I was a kid, that's what you're saying. It's a way of saying, I don't like this because it's not what I'm used to, so it must be wrong. Because it's not what I'm used to. I heard a sermon about this on Sunday in which somebody talked about there being a working dog in the church. And the phrase that they used was, somebody has a therapy dog in church, the Episcopal Church isn't what it used to be. And that's a phrase we use to put something down. It's not what it used to be. Although I would tell you, thank God for that.
Yeah.
Because the Episcopal Church used to be pretty darn awful, actually. Like it used to be pretty bigoted, right, and misogynist, and really supported racial denigration. And in the 60s, like, we changed our mind on that. Some of us, thank God for that, right? And a working dog is not a pet. In fact, you don't pet it. Like, that's the thing, right? You don't pet it. So we're trying to figure this out. And hey, I mean, I've read the Bible, so I can give you all kinds of like biblical arguments in favor of this, but the truth is there weren't working dogs. There were working dogs. They did the cattle, but there weren't seeing eye dogs. They weren't therapy animals. Like, we have no concept of that biblically. Because it's a modern invention.
Is there anything in the Quran that talks about the role of women?
There is really more in the Hadith. I mean, because in the Quran, since we're all like created from God, like, we should be coplanar. There's no clergy on a different plane. So, like, sort of no. And you get this from, how did the prophet treat his wife? And keep in mind, Khadijah kept the guy alive. Khadijah was the one who paid the bills. She was the working man, and he was the stay at home. But you don't hear the Hadith phrased that way. And the prophet had daughters, and he educated them. So it's very interesting that he educated his daughters, but in the Wahhabist, right, like the kind of thing you see in the Taliban, you're against female education, but the prophet educated his girls.
Yeah.
How do they reconcile?
Yeah.
How do they reconcile that?
Well, the same way we reconcile anything we want to.
Very good answer.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think the same argument. It's not like, oh, those Muslims, they're just so hateful to their women. Like, we don't have a leg to stand on.
That's right.
So, and how do we reconcile it? Oh, because of the fall. Because there's this passage in Paul that's like, if I read it the way I want to, it says that, women are, they're like men, they're just, less valuable. like this is the stuff we do, as human beings. It's pretty darn awful. Way easier to see inconsistency than other people.
Does the Holy Quran say anything about homosexuality?
Good question. I mean, I'll just be honest, I haven't read the Holy Quran, and neither has anybody in the room. because you're not indigenous Arabic speakers. So, but the hadith, I mean, this is how you reason through it. Like the prophet wasn't, and culturally that wasn't accepted. And keep in mind that we're still trying to figure this out. Like in the Episcopal Church and in the ELCA Church, those being like the two that are more out front, the UCC as well. The question is, okay, like I don't see anything biblically that says it's okay for a man to have a monogamous relationship with another man, but people didn't do that then. When a man had sex with a man in the ancient world, it was domination, it wasn't intimacy. Because it was expected that marriage was for alliance and for procreation. So that a woman's duty was to have children. I told you this when we talk about the Catholic Church. In the Catholic Church, the sacrament of marriage is predicated around procreation. For us, the sacrament of marriage is predicated on unity, not procreation. That's an interesting move. And so reasonably, if marriage is about unity and not procreation, if that's the point, then what excludes same-sex couples? I mean, that's how we got there, to reason. And because we have texts that say a man can't lie with a man as with a woman. And you can already hear in that idea, well, like a man doesn't lie with a man as with a woman. A man lies with a man as a lover would. Because in the ancient world, right, men are dominant, women are passive. So, I mean, you know, I'm not going to speak for my own marriage, but if I had to be dominant in my marriage, I wouldn't be married to the person I'm married to. She said, hell no, right? And I don't just mean physically, I mean in all ways, right? If I had to be dominant, so we've already said we don't believe in that culture. So why do we want to pick it up for convenience? Because there's something we don't.
Weren't the Greeks, wasn't there homosexuality among
It's
Greeks?
really weird, right? In Greece, it was between a mentor and a mentee. And what do you know? I mean, this is a really interesting thing. I still would condemn that practice because it's not based on equity. It's still pretty common, actually, in the continent that a PhD advisor might have sex with their students. And that's a thing that happens. You should lose your job for that, my opinion, and like go to jail because you have power over your student. That's not equitable. So what do we say? Again, we don't just say, well, anything goes. We say, no, like intimacy is based on choice and equality. And if you don't have choice or equality, whether it's two men or a man and a woman, you don't actually have intimacy. You have an imbalance of power. So if women are dependent upon men, you can't have intimacy. They're objects. My opinion. But I think that's how the church made its ruling, if that makes sense. And that's the kind of thing that's happening not just in Christianity, right? That's happening in all major world religions. Is like, okay, like we've got our texts, but in what sense are we bound to them? Given that there has been cultural change. I'm not trying to preach. I hope these are, but I hope these are like helpful analogies about how we're trying to figure this out, right? And like, as I mentioned to you, a big discussion of women is not just can they be prayer leaders, but look, like if my going in public with my head uncovered causes a man to sin, that's his fault, not mine. I actually would agree, right? So the better thing from women wearing burqas is men to wear like blackgown classes. And this is part of what's happening in Islam, right? Is that women are saying like, this doesn't make sense, right? So the Quran does not say women are for secondary status. The Quran does not say women must pray behind men. These are social conventions that we've come up with because they came from a particular time, particular people, particular place. Okay. there is a lot of frustration with Sharia precisely because of what I'm talking to you about. Just remember when we talked about Judaism? It's just a poll. Who remembers? Which one's older, Reform Judaism or Orthodox?
Reform.
The Reform is older. The Orthodox saw the Reform and said, we don't like that. We're going to go back to the basics.
Ah,
So now, when there's secularization in the world, and you know who gets a lot of credit for that, we as Americans do, because we do relentlessly spread our culture through Coca-Cola and music. It's true, we do. It's true, we really do, right? People see secular American values and they say, wait a minute, this is not the traditional way we're used to. So we need to protect what we're used to wholesale. So this is where you find in these conservative or reactionary Muslim countries resistance to secularization because they're concerned that it's a domino effect. If women start wearing short skirts, the next thing that will happen is they might even start dancing or something. You know, like I hope you understand what I'm saying. So there's this really strong concern that we're going to lose who we are. And when we lose who we are, we're going to lose the way. So let's go back to wearing traditional clothes. Orthodox Jews do that. Do you notice that? It's funny, they don't go real far back. They wear clothes from the Polish nobility in the 1700s. They don't dress like Pharisees, but they go back far enough that it seems traditional, right? I mean, that's what the Amish folks do, right? They froze their clothes in the 1600s. Those aren't traditional Christian clothes. The older clothes would actually be like what Muslims are wearing, right? But they froze them to make sure we didn't secularize by keeping it like we are. And you probably know this, like we can look down on this, but the way Amish people, and I want to make this as a bridge, the way Amish people decide whether or not to adapt technology is not because it's new and different, it's will it negatively affect our family life? Now, I can tell you as somebody who has a TV in my home, it negatively affects my family life. So I don't think they're wrong about it. I don't think they're wrong about the TV. I mean, I'll say it's worth it for what we get some days. Other days, I see that the TV is a distraction for my child. And if my child were bored, then they'd have to develop artistic and social skills. They'd have to play with others because the TV can just distract them, which is the whole concern with Islam anyways. We get distracted and we forget, right? So give a little compassion to these folks, right? They're not entirely wrong. We're just willing to pay the price of these things. Or sometimes we don't realize the price. I still have the TV in my house. If I were single, I'd bring it. Anyway. Okay.
Yeah, and so, look, I mean, I just sort of put in here, you know, like the big thing is there was that big Afghanistan Buddha and Osama bin Laden's people blew that up in Afghanistan. And it was like, you know, everybody was like real upset about this because this is like world, you remember this? This was like in the early 90s, early 2000s, right? With this stuff, late 90s, I think. Like, how can the Taliban destroy this beautiful historic remnant? Never mind that Coptic Christians like destroyed all of the wonders of ancient Egypt, right? But like we forgot about that. So how could these people do that? And the reason they did it is because it was a monument to sin for them. This is an image, somebody who gets treated like a god. So maybe if we like destroy the image, people won't treat Buddha like a god because Buddha's not God. Like this is the Islamic perspective. You can say that doesn't work. The way you fight art is with art. I mean, that's great. Except like, keep in mind that like we have these people who committed treason in the United States. I don't know if you know about these people, and they have statues in colleges named after them, like Robert E. Lee.
Yes.
Oh, he was a gentleman. He committed treason.
Yes.
He did. He committed the biggest insurrection in our history, and he gets honored for that. That's weird. Sorry, that's weird.
There's no statues of Benedict Arnold, are there? Because he wasn't nice. He didn't want to own slaves. I mean, but he did, right? I mean, this is weird stuff. So just keep in mind, we've got our own weird American idiosyncrasies. Like there's a monument outside the Capitol in Austin that's built to remember the War of Northern Aggression. That's what it says on the monument. Anybody seen that one? The War of Northern Aggression.
Yeah.
That was paid for with federal funds. So just keep that in mind when we get mad at these folks, right? But it is true that if you're a Wahhabist, you don't want that stuff. It's tempting people to idolatry. It's tempting people to follow a human being instead of the word that came through a human being, the word of God. Yeah, and so look, we're always kind of in this battle, whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu, right? Like, what do we do with secularism, and what about our fundamentals? And then, of course, it's different being a conservative and a fundamentalist, right? Conservative is saying there is something we'd like to conserve. I don't know what contemporary conservatives are trying to conserve. We don't use that word very well.
So
I hope you know what I'm saying here.
Yeah.
I don't even know what it means to be a conservative.
Well, it means nothing anymore. It means you're a Republican now, right? I mean, we use it interchangeably. It used to mean that we are conserving some core value. So, I mean, I would tell you, in Judaism, the conservatives are conservative Jews
Yeah.
because they're conserving that the Torah is a divinely inspired product and that we have to make decisions in consultation with divine inspiration. And why do I name them up? Because they say that there's some things aren't in the Torah, and that's what we got to figure out. The Torah doesn't tell us what to do, so what do? And conservative Jews say we've got this divine product, and then we've also got like really important, reasonable values, like what about women and what about gay people? Some conservative Jews say, well, the texts say we can't have those. Some conservative Jews, in consultation with the Torah, it's not with their opinion, it's in consultation with the Torah, say, well, actually, that's fine. Right? Like this place over here, Shar HaShalom, has hired their first openly gay rabbi. A lot of conservative Jewish folks wouldn't go for that, but they did. And he even said when he came here, I'm conservative because I want things pinned down from the Torah. I don't want to do whatever I think and say God's there. So that's, just think through. I think that's probably a good definition of conservatism. Christian conservatives might say, well, we believe in the rapture, but that's a 200-year-old idea, not a 2,000-year-old idea. So I'm going to question whether that's true conservatism. People who believe in the devil might say Christians have always believed in that. No, Dante made that up. So I'm going to say, are you really conserving an early tradition, or are you conserving a branch off? I mean, these are important conversations. I sound like I'm doing it accusingly, probably because I am, but I just mean, you know, like it is an important way to have the conversation. What are you conserving? What are you conserving? And I don't hear politicians talk about that.
No, they don't.
They don't. You know, this latest case from the Supreme Court, this came out 3 weeks ago, about whether or not Texas can put buoys in the Rio Grande. Do you know about this? Because the Rio Grande does not belong to the state of Texas.
No.
Right? That's a federal water. That's water of the US, right? So when a state is inhibiting international commerce and international boundaries, which constitutionally that's not supposed to happen. That decision got decided 5-4. So who was the swing voter? John Roberts. So my question is the court actually conserving the Constitution, or are they actually being pretty liberal with the Constitution and changing it? The Constitution says federal property is federal property, and state property is state property. And the Rio Grande is federal property. Why did those four rule that way? Because if you get 1 foot on dry ground, you can get asylum. So that's why we're building these things, so that people can't get the federal law of asylum. If we keep them out of the Rio, we keep them out of dry ground. Now, that's just really strange. That's not conservative at all. Is that okay that I said that? You love when I share my politics. don't you? Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So, look, what I want to do next week is kind of finish up on Islam.
Can I make one comment?
Please.
Is in the last few years, you're talking about renewal. There has been a great outburst of evangelism in Islam. You get much more access to mosques.
Mhm.
The first time Betty and I were ever able to attend prayer was when we went
Was here.
to the Islamic Center here. Before that, you were never invited in. Then slowly, you were invited in some days a week as a visitor, and slowly the amount increased. And now you can get evangelistic booklets in English. But it wasn't, 10 years ago now, to go into the mosque in Manama, Betty had to wear a thobe.
Yeah.
Not a thobe,
A hijab or a
Hijab.
shador,
Complete.
yeah.
yeah,
Absolutely.
and it was interesting.
Well, that
Because, of course,
Yeah, that's true, that even, was sometime last year at the Seabrook Library, they had, the Muslims were there. And, I have a Quran, they gave a paperback Quran, and they gave information about the
Yeah.
questions. I got there a little bit late, but they had conversations
Yeah.
with people there.
yeah,
They gave you a bottle of water when you came. I mean.
and come and join us. It's very much
Yeah, in fact, there's an
opening,
event this
particularly in
Sunday
America.
you can do at the MCC, the Multicultural Center, called Get to Know Your Muslim Neighbor.
Is that not just for our church, is it
It's
for,
kind of for the community.
for the community?
Yeah,
Oh,
and so
excellent.
like the rabbi and some people from the conservative synagogue are going. I'm
Mhm.
planning to go, if my spouse will support me going. They're putting on dinner, like at no cost to you.
Excuse me.
You'll see it in the e-news today, right? And it'll be halal, I'm sure it will be. And I bet it'll be really nice food. And
But-
it's from like 4 to 7.
And that's another tradition, and we saw it at the Islamic Center. Food is an important part of our relationship,
I mean,
that we eat together.
It is for us
Yeah.
too. Now, it's a
better.
funny thing, right? Because when we have a pork barbecue here, that's not gonna be very inviting to our Jewish and Muslim neighbors. But good brisket, which our Jewish neighbors can't eat because it's not kosher. I guarantee you, we didn't buy kosher brisket. Anyway, this is the thing to think through, and I appreciate what David's saying. Just so you get an idea about revivalism, consider that 20 years ago in the Episcopal Church, that communion was for baptized Christians of all denominations. But now, a number of churches are saying that communion is for people who want it. So that's a move towards
Yeah.
openness, invitation, inclusivity. And again, you're finding that in Islam. You know, there's the Gideons that put Bibles in hotels.
Yes.
Well, there's a similar group that's putting Quran translations in hotels. Like I've stayed in a few hotels that have the Gideon Bible and have the English version of the Quran. And that's because they believe in what they believe, and they would like others to have the opportunity to get it right.
Well, isn't it also so that we can see that Islam is not this terrifying?
It's both and. Once we get past our cultural terror, perhaps we'll see it's the true faith.
It gives us a better understanding.
Yeah.
I think.
So it's hard to tell whether get to know your Muslim neighbor is to build tolerance, respect, or conversion. And I would tell you probably all three of those goals are
Yeah.
part of it. I'm not converting to Islam because I didn't speak Arabic. And it will never be my core language. Christianity is my core language. It's the one I'm most fluid with, right? There's some beautiful things about Islam, and I'll give you some more reminder of those next week. But it's just not for me at the core. I don't know if that makes sense, but neither is Judaism. I want to be Jewish. I do. Like Judaism just seems so much healthier, you know, it does. But it's not my core language. It's not, you know, it's not. So here I am stuck as a priest. Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll finish next 10.
Okay, 9 o'clock next week. Okay, 9 o'clock next week.